The glass doors of the Grandview Hotel banquet hall swung open, and the noise inside hit like a wave. Daniel Carter stood frozen for a second, his hand still on the door handle, wondering if this had been a mistake. Loud music, clinking glasses, and the booming laugh of someone he recognized instantly made his stomach tighten. 20 years had passed since he last stood in a room full of these faces, but some things never change. The laugh belonged to Marcus Cole, and it still carried that same tone of mockery Daniel remembered from high school hallways. Daniel almost turned around right there. He had told himself all week that this reunion would be different, that people grow up, that old wounds fade. But standing at the entrance, watching Marcus hold court in the center of the room with a drink in his hand, Daniel felt 16 years old again. A small hand slipped into his. He looked down at his daughter Mia, 8 years old, wearing her favorite blue dress, looking up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Are we going in, Dad?" she asked. Daniel took a breath. He had brought Mia because he could not find a sitter, and honestly, part of him wanted her there. She was the reason he got up every morning, the reason he worked double shifts at the auto shop, the reason none of the mockery from the past actually mattered anymore, or so he told himself. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile. "Let's go in." They stepped through the doorway together, and within seconds, heads began to turn. Daniel scanned the room, searching for a quiet corner where he could sit with Mia and let the evening pass without much notice. That plan lasted less than 2 minutes. "Well, well, well," came the voice, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Look who decided to show up." "Danny boy, is that really you?" Daniel turned to see Marcus walking toward him, drink in hand, a group of old classmates trailing behind like an audience waiting for a show. Marcus looked exactly like Daniel remembered, just with more expensive clothes and a little more weight around his face. "Hey, Marcus," Daniel said evenly. "Good to see you." "Good to see you too," Marcus said, his eyes already sweeping over Daniel's outfit, a simple button-up shirt and jeans. Nothing fancy, nothing that screamed success. "Still working with your hands, I take it? I heard you fix cars now." "I do," Daniel said. "Own a small shop." "A small shop," Marcus repeated, turning to his audience with a grin, as if he had just been handed a punchline. "Well, at least you found something. Not everyone gets to be a big shot like some of us." He gestured vaguely toward himself, and a few people around him chuckled. Daniel felt his jaw tighten, but kept his expression calm. He had learned a long time ago that reacting only made things worse. He gently squeezed Mia's hand, silently reminding himself why he was here, and it was not to relive old rivalries. "And who is this little one?" Marcus asked, crouching slightly to look at Mia. "Your daughter, right? I heard about that. Heard her mom left not long after she was born." His voice carried just enough volume for the surrounding group to hear clearly. The words landed like a slap, though Daniel refused to let it show. Mia looked up at her father, confused by the tone in the stranger's voice, sensing something was wrong even if she did not understand the words. "That's not really something we need to discuss here," Daniel said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm building inside him. "Oh, come on. We're all friends here," Marcus said, standing back up, clearly enjoying the attention he was drawing. "I'm just saying, man, life really has its twists, doesn't it? Here I am running one of the biggest real estate firms in 3 states, driving a car worth more than your shop probably makes in a year, and you're over here playing single dad, fixing brakes for a living." He shook his head slowly, feigning sympathy. "Guess we all end up where we're supposed to, huh?" A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the small crowd. Some people looked away, clearly uneasy, but nobody said anything to stop him. Daniel felt the familiar heat rise in his chest, the same helpless anger he used to feel in the school cafeteria when Marcus and his friends would target anyone who did not fit their idea of important. He glanced down at Mia, who was staring at the floor now, her earlier excitement about the fancy party completely drained from her face. That was the moment Daniel decided enough was enough, not with anger, not with a scene, but with quiet resolve. "It was good seeing you, Marcus," Daniel said, forcing his voice to stay level. "Come on, Mia. Let's go find a seat." He turned to walk away, but Marcus was not finished. He raised his voice just slightly louder, ensuring more people around them would hear. "Hey, Don't take it personally, Danny. Somebody has to keep the world running with oil changes and tire rotations, right? Not all of us can be leaders. More laughter followed, and Daniel felt his shoulders tense as he guided Mia toward an empty table near the back of the hall. He could feel eyes on him, whispers trailing behind him like smoke. He had expected some awkwardness coming back after all these years, but he had not expected to be turned into entertainment within the first 5 minutes. As they reached the table, Mia tugged on his sleeve. "Dad," she whispered, "why was that man being mean to you?" Daniel knelt down to her eye level, doing his best to keep his voice warm and reassuring, despite the storm still swirling in his chest. "Sometimes people say things because it makes them feel bigger," he said gently. "It doesn't mean anything about us, okay? We know who we are." Mia nodded, though the uncertainty in her eyes told him she was not entirely convinced. Daniel pulled out a chair for her and sat down beside her, glancing around the room, wondering if leaving early might be the better option. The evening had barely started, and already it felt like a mistake. Across the room, Marcus was still talking, clearly not done using Daniel as his evening's entertainment. He had turned back to his group, gesturing animatedly, recounting some exaggerated version of a high school memory that painted Daniel as the punchline. Daniel could not hear the exact words from where he sat, but he could see the reactions, some laughing, some looking uncomfortable, a few glancing toward him with something like pity. Daniel reached for a glass of water, trying to steady himself. He told himself this was fine, that he did not need anyone's approval, that his life, however modest it looked from the outside, was built on something real. Mia was healthy, happy most days, and loved deeply. He worked hard, paid his bills, and never once regretted staying to raise her alone after her mother left. None of that mattered to people like Marcus, who measured worth in cars and titles, but Daniel reminded himself it did not need to. Still, sitting there, watching the room buzz with a version of himself that was not true, a smaller, weaker version, crafted entirely by someone else's cruelty, Daniel felt the old wound reopen. He had spent years building a quiet, stable life, and it took less than 5 minutes for it to feel like none of that mattered in this room. He was about to suggest to Mia that they get something to eat and try to enjoy at least part of the evening, when Marcus's voice rose again, louder this time, clearly encouraged by the attention he was receiving. "You know what's funny?" Marcus said, loud enough that it carried clearly across several tables now. "I always wondered what happened to the guys who peaked in high school and then just disappeared. Turns out they end up exactly where you'd expect. No offense, Danny, but some of us were always meant for bigger things." The comment landed hard, and this time several people near Daniel's table turned to look at him, some with sympathy, others simply curious to see how he would react. Daniel felt his face flush, embarrassment and anger mixing together in a way that made his hands tighten around the water glass in front of him. Mia looked at him again, her small face full of concern. "Dad, can we go home?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel exhaled slowly, trying to keep his composure for her sake. "Just a little longer, sweetheart," he said, though every part of him wanted to say yes and walk straight out the door. He glanced toward the exit, calculating how quickly they could leave without drawing more attention. That was when a new voice cut through the noise of the room, sharp, clear, and impossible to ignore. "That's enough, Marcus." The words were not loud, but there was something in the tone, something commanding, that made the surrounding chatter fall away almost instantly. Heads turned toward the entrance of the hall, where a woman stood, dressed simply, but with an unmistakable presence, the kind of presence that filled a room without needing volume. Daniel looked up, along with almost everyone else nearby, and felt his breath catch slightly. He recognized the face immediately, though it took his mind a moment to fully register who was standing there. Elena Vance. He remembered her from high school, quiet, often overlooked, someone who had kept mostly to herself back then. Now she stood at the entrance of the reunion hall, with the kind of quiet authority that made even Marcus pause mid-sentence. Whispers rippled through the room. Daniel had heard her name mentioned once or twice over the years, something about a technology company she had built from nothing into one of the fastest-growing firms in the country, but he had never expected to see her here, and certainly never expected her to be the one speaking up. Marcus turned, his earlier confidence faltering slightly as he registered who had interrupted him. "Elena," he he said, his tone shifting into something more careful, almost cautious. Wow, it's been a while. Great to see you. Elena did not smile. She walked further into the hall, her eyes moving briefly toward Daniel and Mia, before settling back on Marcus. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I could hear you from the hallway, Elena said, her voice calm but firm, carrying easily across the now silent room. And I think everyone here just heard exactly the kind of person you still are. A nervous murmur passed through the crowd. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but Elena was not finished. You've been standing here for the past 10 minutes mocking a man for working an honest job and raising his daughter alone, she continued, her gaze steady, unwavering. Meanwhile, you're bragging about a car and a title like that's what makes someone valuable. She paused, letting the words settle before adding, It's interesting, because I remember exactly who Daniel Carter was in high school, and it certainly was not someone who needed to put others down to feel important. Marcus's face shifted, the smugness draining slowly as he realized the room's attention had turned entirely against him. He glanced around, searching for support, but found only uncomfortable silence and lowered eyes. Daniel sat frozen at his table, stunned by the sudden turn of events. Mia looked up at him, her earlier worry replaced by wide-eyed curiosity as she watched the powerful woman standing near the entrance defend her father in front of an entire room. Elena took a few steps closer, until she was standing near Daniel's table, her expression softening slightly as she looked down at him. Mind if I join you too? She asked, her voice gentler now, though still carrying the same quiet strength. Daniel, still processing what had just happened, could only nod. Of course, he managed to say. Please. As Elena pulled out a chair and sat down beside them, the rest of the room slowly returned to its own conversations, though the energy had shifted entirely. Marcus lingered awkwardly for a moment, before retreating toward the bar, his earlier bravado nowhere to be found. Daniel turned to Elena, still trying to make sense of everything. I appreciate that, he said quietly. You didn't have to do that. Elena looked at him steadily, something unreadable in her expression. Actually, she said, I did. Mia, sensing the tension had eased, tugged gently on her father's sleeve. Dad, who is this? She whispered. Before Daniel could answer, Elena smiled warmly at the little girl. I'm an old friend of your dad's, she said, someone who owes him more than he probably remembers. Daniel frowned slightly, confused by her words, but before he could ask what she meant, the evening's host called everyone's attention toward the front of the room for the beginning of the formal program. Elena glanced at Daniel, a quiet promise in her eyes. We'll talk more, she said softly. There's something I've wanted to tell you for a long time. Daniel nodded, his earlier humiliation now replaced by a strange, cautious curiosity. Whatever Elena Vance had to say, he had a feeling this reunion was about to take a turn nobody in that room had expected, least of all him. The lights dimmed slightly as the host stepped up to the small stage at the front of the hall, tapping the microphone before launching into a cheerful welcome speech about old memories and new beginnings. Daniel barely heard a word of it. His mind was still spinning from the last few minutes, replaying Elena's calm, unshaken voice cutting through Marcus's mockery like it was nothing. He glanced sideways at her, sitting quietly beside him now, her attention seemingly on the stage, though Daniel noticed the faint, thoughtful expression on her face, as if she too were somewhere else entirely, lost in a memory from long ago. Mia leaned against her father's arm, already growing sleepy despite her earlier excitement about the fancy party. Daniel wrapped an arm around her, grateful for the quiet moment, even as questions swirled in his mind. Why had Elena stepped in so forcefully? What did she mean about owing him something? He had barely known her back in school, or so he thought. As the host continued rambling through reunion announcements, Daniel found himself sneaking glances at Elena, trying to piece together fragments of memory from 20 years ago. He remembered her vaguely, a quiet girl who sat near the back of most classes, someone who rarely spoke up, someone the popular crowd mostly ignored rather than targeted. He could not recall a single specific interaction between them, yet here she was, defending him with a conviction that suggested a story he had long forgotten. The host finally wrapped up the opening remarks, inviting everyone to enjoy the buffet before the evening's planned activities began. Chairs scraped against the floor as people stood and made their way toward the food tables, the earlier tension in the room slowly dissolving into normal reunion chatter. Elena turned to Daniel, her expression softer now that the spotlight of the room had shifted elsewhere. "Would you like to get some food?" she asked. "I think we have quite a bit to catch up on." Daniel looked down at Mia, who was rubbing her eyes sleepily. "I should probably get some food for her too," he said. "Of course," Elena said, standing and offering a hand to help gather their things. "Let's all go together." As they made their way toward the buffet line, Daniel noticed several classmates watching them with obvious curiosity, whispers following in their wake. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on helping Mia choose food from the spread laid out before them. Once they returned to the table with their plates, Mia quickly became absorbed in her food, leaving Daniel and Elena a moment of relative privacy amid the surrounding noise of the reunion. "I owe you an explanation," Elena said quietly, setting her own plate down but not touching it yet. "About earlier." Daniel shook his head slightly. "You don't owe me anything. I just don't understand why you stepped in like that. We barely knew each other back then." Elena's expression grew distant for a moment, her eyes drifting somewhere beyond the room, beyond the present moment entirely. "That's not exactly true," she said softly. "There's something I don't think you remember, but I never forgot it." Daniel leaned forward slightly, curiosity overtaking his earlier embarrassment. "What do you mean?" Elena took a slow breath, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "Junior year," she began. "There was an incident in the science hallway. Do you remember that?" Daniel frowned, trying to pull the memory from somewhere deep in the past. "Vaguely," he admitted. "There was some kind of commotion, wasn't there? I don't really remember the details." "I was the one in the middle of it," Elena said quietly. "Marcus and his friends had been targeting me for weeks. Small things at first, comments about how I dressed, how quiet I was, but it escalated that day. They cornered me by the lockers and things got out of hand." Her voice remained steady, though Daniel could see the memory still carried weight for her, even after all these years. "I remember someone stepping in," Daniel said slowly, the fragments of memory beginning to piece themselves together. "But I didn't realize it was you." "It was," Elena said, "and the person who stepped in, who told them to back off and actually meant it, who stayed with me afterward to make sure I was okay even though it wasn't his problem to deal with, that was you." Daniel sat back slightly, stunned. He vaguely remembered an incident in the hallway, remembered feeling like something was wrong and needing to intervene, but the details had faded over the years, blurred among countless other high school memories. "I didn't even know your name back then," Elena continued, "but I never forgot what you did. You didn't know me, you had nothing to gain, and you still stood up for me when nobody else would. That kind of thing stays with a person." Daniel felt a strange mixture of emotions rising in his chest: surprise, humility, and something like quiet pride at hearing that a small act from decades ago had mattered so much to someone he barely remembered helping. "I had no idea that stuck with you," he said softly. "It did," Elena said, a faint smile crossing her face for the first time that evening. "More than you probably realize. And when I walked in tonight and saw Marcus doing to you exactly what he used to do to people like me, I couldn't just stand there and watch." Mia, having finished most of her food, looked up curiously at the two adults deep in conversation. "Is this a happy story?" she asked innocently, sensing the shift in tone between them. Elena laughed softly, the sound warm and genuine. "Yes," she said, glancing at Daniel. "I think it is." Daniel felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had been carrying since walking through the hotel doors that evening finally beginning to ease. Whatever else happened tonight, whatever Marcus and his friends thought of him, none of it seemed to matter quite as much anymore. As the buffet line began to thin and reunion attendees settled back into their seats for the evening's planned entertainment, Daniel found himself unexpectedly grateful for the very party he had almost skipped entirely. Somewhere in the middle of an evening that started with humiliation, something unexpected had shifted, and he had a feeling the night was far from over. The band on the small stage began playing a slow, easy tune, and couples started drifting toward the open floor near the center of the hall. Daniel stayed seated, watching Mia grow drowsier by the minute, her head now resting against his arm. Elena sat across from him, quietly observing the room, though Daniel noticed her attention kept returning to him and Mia rather than the dancers. "She's a sweet girl," Elena said, nodding toward Mia. "You're doing a good job with her." Daniel smiled faintly, brushing a hand gently over his daughter's hair. "Some days it doesn't feel like it," he admitted. "But she keeps me going. She's the reason I get out of bed every morning, honestly." "That's more than most people can say," Elena replied. "I've met a lot of successful people in my line of work. People with impressive titles and even more impressive bank accounts. And very few of them have that kind of clarity about why they do what they do." Daniel glanced at her, curious. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did it take you this long to say something?" he asked. "I mean, we haven't spoken in 20 years. What made tonight the night you decided to step in?" Elena considered the question for a moment before answering. "Honestly, I didn't plan it," she said. "I almost didn't come tonight either. Reunions aren't really my thing anymore. Too much small talk. Too many people trying to figure out how much money I make now." She smiled wryly. "But something told me to come anyway. And when I walked in and heard Marcus doing exactly what he used to do, going after someone who couldn't easily fight back in that setting, something in me just refused to stay quiet. Maybe I owed it to the girl I used to be, the one who never had anyone speak up until you did." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing her words. There was something remarkably grounded about Elena, despite everything he now understood about her success. She did not carry herself with the same performative confidence Marcus had displayed all evening. Instead, there was a quiet steadiness to her, the kind that came from having actually earned everything she had, rather than simply inheriting comfort or coasting on charm. "I appreciate it," Daniel said again. "More than you know. It's been a strange night." "I imagine so," Elena said, glancing toward the dance floor where Marcus was now attempting to laugh loudly with a different group, clearly trying to recover some of his earlier standing in the room. "For what it's worth, people like him rarely change. They just get better at hiding it behind nicer suits." Daniel chuckled softly at that, the first real laugh he had allowed himself since walking through the hotel doors. Mia stirred slightly against his arm, mumbling something about being tired, and Daniel gently patted her back to settle her. Across the room, a small cluster of former classmates had begun whispering among themselves, occasionally glancing toward Daniel's table. Daniel noticed the attention but tried not to let it bother him, especially with Elena sitting beside him, a steady presence that made the whispers feel far less threatening than they might have otherwise. After a few minutes, one of the classmates, a woman named Bridget Hollis, who Daniel vaguely remembered from his chemistry class, approached the table with a hesitant smile. "Daniel, right?" she asked. "I don't know if you remember me." "Bridget," Daniel said, recalling her name after a moment. "Of course. Good to see you. I just wanted to say," Bridget began, glancing briefly toward Elena before continuing, "what Marcus said earlier wasn't fair. A lot of us felt uncomfortable, but nobody really knew what to say." She paused, looking slightly embarrassed. "I'm sorry we didn't say anything sooner." Daniel offered a small, understanding smile. "It's all right," he said. "I appreciate you saying something now." Bridget nodded, seeming relieved by his response, before glancing again at Elena. "It was pretty amazing, what you did," she said to Elena. "Nobody expected that." Elena shrugged modestly. "Sometimes people just need someone to say what everyone else is already thinking." Bridget smiled, said a polite goodbye, and returned to her group, though Daniel noticed the tone of conversation around the room had shifted subtly. A few more classmates glanced his way, some offering small nods of acknowledgement, a marked difference from the whispered pity he had sensed earlier in the evening. As the night went on, the band shifted into livelier songs, and more people took to the dance floor, laughter and conversation filling the hall in a much more comfortable rhythm than the tense atmosphere from earlier. Daniel found himself relaxing slightly, though Mia had now fully drifted off, her small head resting against his shoulder. "Looks like someone's ready to go home," Elena said gently, watching the sleeping child with a soft expression. "Yeah," Daniel said, glancing at his watch. "It's probably past her bedtime anyway." "Before you go," Elena said, her tone shifting slightly, becoming more purposeful, "I wanted to ask you something, if you don't mind." Daniel looked at her, curious. "Sure, go ahead." "What exactly do you do at your shop?" Elena asked. Beyond the basic repairs, I mean. Do you handle diagnostics, electrical systems, anything more specialized? Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly at the specificity of the question. I handle pretty much everything, he said. Diagnostics, electrical work, engine repair, even some custom modifications when clients want them. It's a small shop, but we do quality work. I actually trained for years before opening my own place. Wanted to make sure I really knew what I was doing before taking on that kind of responsibility. Elena nodded thoughtfully, clearly processing this information with more interest than Daniel expected. That's impressive, she said. More technical than most people realize, I'd guess. It has its challenges, Daniel admitted, but I enjoy it. There's something satisfying about fixing something that's broken, seeing it work again because of something you did with your own hands. Elena smiled at that, something thoughtful crossing her expression, though she did not elaborate further. Well, she said, standing from her chair, I don't want to keep you if Mia needs to get home, but I'd like to continue this conversation, if you're open to it. Perhaps over coffee sometime this week? Daniel hesitated for a brief moment, surprised by the invitation, before nodding. I'd like that, he said. Elena reached into a small clutch she had been carrying and pulled out a business card, handing it to him with a warm smile. My number's on there, she said. Call any time. Daniel took the card, glancing briefly at the sleek design before tucking it carefully into his shirt pocket. Thank you, he said, for everything tonight. Thank you, Elena replied, her voice softening. For something you probably don't even remember doing 20 years ago. As Elena said her goodbyes and moved to rejoin other conversations across the room, Daniel gently gathered Mia into his arms, careful not to wake her, and made his way toward the exit. He passed by a few more classmates along the way, several offering warm nods or small smiles, a stark contrast to the mocking atmosphere that had greeted him just a few hours earlier. Near the entrance, he caught sight of Marcus one last time, standing near the bar, his earlier bravado noticeably subdued. Their eyes met briefly across the room. Marcus looked away first, something unreadable crossing his face, perhaps embarrassment, perhaps something closer to genuine reflection. Daniel did not linger on the moment. He had nothing left to prove to Marcus, not tonight, not ever again. Stepping out into the cool night air, Daniel carried his sleeping daughter toward the car, the weight of her small body a familiar comfort against the strange whirlwind of emotions the evening had stirred within him. He settled her carefully into her car seat, brushing a strand of hair from her face before closing the door and walking around to the driver's side. Sitting behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine, Daniel allowed himself to finally process everything that had happened. He had walked into that reunion expecting nothing more than an uncomfortable evening of forced small talk and old wounds reopened. Instead, he had found something entirely unexpected, a reminder that small acts of kindness, even ones long forgotten by the person who gave them, could ripple forward in ways nobody could predict. He glanced at the business card still tucked in his shirt pocket, Elena Vance's name printed in clean, simple lettering, and wondered what exactly she had in mind for their coffee conversation. Whatever it was, Daniel had a feeling this reunion had shifted something in his life that would not simply fade away with the morning light. Starting the car, he pulled out of the hotel parking lot, glancing once more in the rearview mirror at the glowing windows of the banquet hall, growing smaller behind him. Whatever happened next, he thought, tonight had already given him something he had not expected walking through those doors, a reminder that the people who truly saw his worth were not always the ones who shouted the loudest. 3 days passed before Daniel finally worked up the nerve to call the number on the business card. He had carried it in his shirt pocket, then his wallet, glancing at it more than once while closing up the shop each evening, wondering if reaching out was really necessary, or if the reunion had simply been a strange, isolated moment that did not need to extend any further into his daily life. It was Mia, in the end, who convinced him. She had asked about Elena twice since the reunion, curious about the woman who had spoken so firmly to the mean man at the party, and something about her innocent curiosity made Daniel realize he owed it to himself, if nothing else, to follow through on a simple cup of coffee. He dialed the number on a quiet Thursday afternoon, standing in the small office at the back of his shop, surrounded by invoices and parts catalogs. Elena answered on the second ring, her voice warm and immediately recognizable. "Daniel," she said, "I was starting to think you might not call. Sorry about the delay, he said, leaning against the edge of his cluttered desk. Things have been busy at the shop. No need to apologize, Elena replied. I imagine running your own business keeps you plenty occupied. They settled on meeting the following Saturday morning at a small coffee shop not far from downtown, a quiet place with large windows and the comfortable smell of fresh pastries. Daniel arranged for Mia to spend the morning with his neighbor, an older woman named Carol, who often watched her during weekend errands, and found himself oddly nervous as the day approached. When Saturday arrived, Daniel walked into the coffee shop a few minutes early, spotting Elena already seated near the window, a laptop open in front of her, though she closed it as soon as she noticed him approaching. Right on time, she said, smiling as he settled into the chair across from her. I appreciate punctuality. It says a lot about a person. Old habit from the shop, Daniel said. Customers don't appreciate waiting around. They ordered coffee, and for a while, the conversation remained light, catching up on years long past, comparing notes on former classmates, sharing a few laughs about half-forgotten memories from high school hallways. Daniel found himself relaxing more than he expected, the easy rhythm of conversation with Elena feeling surprisingly natural despite how little they had actually known each other back then. Eventually, Elena set her coffee cup down and leaned forward slightly, her tone shifting into something more focused. I wanted to talk to you about something, she said, beyond just catching up. I figured as much, Daniel said, offering a small smile. You asked some pretty specific questions about my shop at the reunion. Elena laughed softly. Guilty, she admitted. Let me explain. My company has been expanding into a new division over the past year, focused on vehicle technology, diagnostics, and maintenance systems for fleet operations. We work with several logistics companies, helping them manage large vehicle fleets more efficiently, using smarter diagnostic tools. Daniel nodded slowly, listening intently, though he was not yet sure where this was heading. The technology side is strong, Elena continued, but we've been missing something crucial, someone with real, hands-on mechanical experience who understands the practical side of vehicle maintenance, not just the theory. Someone who can help bridge the gap between our engineers and the actual mechanics who will be using these systems every day. Daniel raised an eyebrow, beginning to understand where the conversation was heading. Are you offering me a job? He asked, a mixture of surprise and curiosity in his voice. Not exactly a job, Elena clarified. More of a partnership. I'd like you to consult with our development team, share your expertise, help us design systems that actually make sense for mechanics in the field, not just what looks good on paper in a boardroom. You would still run your shop, but you'd also have a role with us, part-time at first, with flexibility around your schedule as a father. Daniel sat back slightly, processing the offer. It was not something he had expected walking into this coffee meeting, and certainly not something he had considered as a possibility for his future. I appreciate the offer, he said slowly, but I'm not sure I have the kind of experience you're looking for. I'm a mechanic, not an engineer. That's exactly the point, Elena said firmly. We have plenty of engineers. What we don't have is someone who actually understands the reality of working under a car every day. Someone who can tell us when our brilliant ideas simply won't work in practice. Your experience is exactly what we need. Not despite being a mechanic, but because of it. Daniel considered her words carefully, turning the offer over in his mind. Part of him felt a familiar hesitation, the same instinct that had kept him cautious and grounded ever since becoming a single father, wary of anything that seemed too good to be true, wary of disrupting the stable, if modest, life he had built for himself and Mia. I'd need to think about it, he said honestly. This is a lot to consider, especially with Mia. Of course, Elena said, nodding understandingly. There's no pressure, and no rush. I just wanted you to know the opportunity exists, and that I genuinely believe you'd bring real value to what we're building. They continued talking for a while longer, Elena outlining more details about the potential arrangement, including flexible hours, competitive compensation, and the possibility of working mostly from his own shop, with occasional visits to her company's offices for meetings with the development team. The more she explained, the more Daniel found himself genuinely intrigued, despite his initial hesitation. As their coffee meeting wound down, Elena glanced at him with a thoughtful expression. Can I ask you something else? she said. Of course. Why did you stay? She asked. After Mia's mother left, a lot of people, understandably, would have struggled to manage everything alone. What made you stay, and stay so committed? Daniel considered the question for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. She's my daughter, he said simply. There was never really a decision to make, not one I was willing to consider seriously. I know some people look at my life and see struggle, see someone who didn't reach for something bigger, but honestly, raising her the right way, giving her stability and love, that's always felt like the biggest thing I could possibly do. Elena listened quietly, something soft and thoughtful in her expression as he spoke. That's a rare kind of clarity, she said eventually. Most people spend their whole lives chasing something bigger without ever really understanding what actually matters. You figured that out a long time ago. Daniel offered a small, humble smile. I don't know about that, he said. Some days it just feels like getting through, one shift at a time. Maybe, Elena said. But there's strength in that too, more than people like Marcus will ever understand. As they finished their coffee and prepared to part ways, Elena reached out and placed a hand briefly on Daniel's arm. Take your time deciding, she said. But I hope you'll consider it seriously. I think this could be good for both of us, and honestly, I think it could be good for the industry too, having someone with real integrity involved in decisions that actually affect working mechanics. Daniel nodded, appreciating her sincerity. I'll think about it, he promised. And thank you, again, for everything. They said their goodbyes outside the coffee shop, Elena heading toward a sleek car parked nearby, Daniel walking the short distance back toward his own modest vehicle, his mind swirling with possibilities he had not considered just a few days earlier. Whatever he decided, one thing had already become clear to him. The reunion that had started with humiliation had, in the strangest possible way, opened a door he never expected to find. Over the following week, Daniel found himself thinking about Elena's offer at odd moments, while replacing a timing belt for a regular customer, while helping Mia with her homework at the kitchen table, while lying awake at night, turning the possibilities over in his mind. He spoke with his older sister Grace on the phone one evening, laying out the details of the offer and asking what she thought. It sounds like a real opportunity, Grace said, but only you know if it fits with what you want for you and Mia. That's the thing, Daniel admitted. I don't know if I even trust it yet. It feels like it came out of nowhere. Maybe it did, Grace said gently, but not every good thing needs a complicated explanation. Sometimes people just recognize value in someone, especially someone who deserves it. Her words stayed with him over the following days. He thought about the years he had spent building his shop from almost nothing, the long hours, the sacrifices, the quiet pride he took in doing honest work. He thought about Mia, about the kind of example he wanted to set for her, not just working hard, but recognizing opportunities to grow, without losing sight of what mattered most. By the following weekend, Daniel had made his decision. He called Elena and agreed to the consulting arrangement, with the understanding that his primary commitment remained his shop and his daughter, with the new role fitting carefully around that foundation rather than replacing it. Elena welcomed the decision warmly, and within a few weeks, Daniel found himself occasionally traveling to her company's offices for meetings with the development team, offering practical insights that visibly reshaped some of their diagnostic tools for the better. The engineers, initially somewhat skeptical of an outside mechanic offering opinions on their sophisticated technology, quickly came to respect his input once they saw how accurately he identified gaps between their designs and real-world usage. Meanwhile, back in his hometown, word of the reunion incident had spread further than Daniel expected, carried through the small, interconnected networks of former classmates who still kept in touch. Several people reached out to him in the weeks that followed, some simply to reconnect, others expressing genuine admiration for how the evening had unfolded. Marcus, notably, remained quiet during this period. Daniel heard through mutual acquaintances that his real estate business had been facing some difficulties, nothing catastrophic, but enough that his usual bravado had softened considerably. Daniel felt no particular satisfaction in hearing this, no desire for further conflict or vindication. He had moved past that evening with something far more valuable than any sense of triumph over an old rival. Still, fate arranged one more encounter between them several months later, at Daniel's shop of all places. Marcus arrived one afternoon, his car making an unusual noise he could not diagnose himself, clearly unaware whose shop he had chosen, from a quick search of local mechanics. Daniel recognized him immediately as he stepped out of his car in the shop's small parking lot, an awkward, uncertain expression replacing his usual confident smirk. "Daniel," Marcus said, clearly caught off guard. "I didn't realize this was your place." "Small town," Daniel said simply, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "What seems to be the problem?" Marcus explained the strange noise his car had been making, his usual bravado noticeably absent, replaced by something quieter, almost humbled. Daniel listened professionally, running a quick diagnostic check before identifying a straightforward issue with the vehicle's suspension system. As Daniel worked, Marcus lingered nearby, an unusual awkward silence settling between them. Eventually Marcus spoke again, his voice quieter than Daniel had ever heard it. "Look," he said, "about the reunion, I was out of line. I've thought about it a lot since then, honestly." Daniel paused his work for a moment, glancing at Marcus with a steady, measured expression. "I appreciate you saying that," he said simply. "I don't really have an excuse," Marcus continued. "I guess old habits, trying to impress people, I don't know. It wasn't fair to you, or to your daughter." Daniel considered his response carefully before speaking. "We all carry things from high school longer than we probably should," he said. "I'm not interested in holding on to old grudges. Everyone deserves the chance to grow." Marcus nodded, something like genuine gratitude crossing his features. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I mean that." They did not become friends after that encounter, nor did Daniel expect them to, but something in their exchange felt like a quiet closure to a chapter that had defined far too much of both their lives for far too long. Daniel finished the repair efficiently, charged a fair price, and sent Marcus on his way, with nothing more than professional courtesy, the entire interaction a far cry from the humiliation of that reunion evening months earlier. As the months passed, Daniel's life settled into a new, richer rhythm. His shop continued thriving, bolstered by both his continued dedication and the additional income from his consulting work with Elena's company. He carefully balanced his time, ensuring Mia never felt the absence of his attention despite his growing responsibilities, often bringing her along to simpler shop tasks on weekends, teaching her small things about how engines worked, watching her curiosity blossom in ways that made him proud beyond words. Elena remained a steady presence in his life, their professional relationship evolving naturally into a genuine friendship built on mutual respect. She would occasionally stop by his shop when passing through town, sometimes bringing small gifts for Mia, always taking time to ask how they were both doing, beyond simply discussing business matters. One evening, several months after the reunion, Daniel sat on the porch of his modest home, watching Mia ride her bicycle up and down the quiet street, her laughter carrying through the warm evening air. He thought back to that night at the Grandview Hotel, to the humiliation he had almost let define the entire evening, to the unexpected voice that had cut through the noise and changed everything. He thought about how easy it would have been to leave early that night, to avoid the whole ordeal entirely, and how much he would have missed if he had. Sometimes, he realized, the moments that seem the most difficult, the most humiliating, carry within them the seeds of something far greater than anyone could have predicted. Mia rode her bicycle back toward the porch, skidding to a slightly wobbly stop in front of him, her face bright with the simple joy of a warm summer evening. "Dad," she said, catching her breath, "are you happy?" Daniel smiled, considering the question with the honest weight it deserved. "Yeah," he said softly, "I really am." "Me too," Mia said, grinning before pedaling off again down the quiet street. Daniel watched her go, feeling a deep, settled contentment he had not expected to find on the other side of that difficult reunion evening. He had walked into that hall bracing for humiliation, and had walked out with something far more valuable, a reminder that quiet integrity, patience, and genuine kindness, even small acts, easily forgotten by the one who gave them, could return in the most unexpected ways, carried forward by people who never forgot what it meant to be truly seen. As the sun began to set behind the houses across the street, casting warm golden light across the quiet neighborhood, Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching his daughter ride freely under the darkening sky, grateful for a life built not on the loud validation of others, but on something far more lasting, the simple, steady truth of who he really was.